In the heart of a prison where silence is forced and fear is the law, one chilling event shocked every soul behind those walls. Imagine a punishment so cruel, so merciless, that even hardened criminals stood frozen, unable to believe what they were witnessing. This is not a story about escape or redemption. It's about a woman whose life ended in the most brutal way possible, stoned to death inside a prison courtyard, in front of hundreds of inmates who were forced to watch. When we think of prisons, we often imagine harsh conditions, tiny cells, violent guards, endless days of hopelessness. But this prison was different. Here, punishment went beyond solitary confinement, beyond beatings, beyond the usual cruelty of prison life. Here, justice was turned into a spectacle. The woman at the center of this story was not just accused, she was condemned in the oldest, most barbaric form of punishment still lurking in hidden corners of the world. The prisoners whispered about what was coming long before it happened. Rumors spread through the cell blocks like wildfire. Some said she had broken the strict moral code of the prison. Others insisted she was framed by guards who wanted to make an example out of her. Nobody knew the exact truth, but one thing was certain. The decision had been made. There would be no trial, no chance for defense, no appeal. Her fate was sealed by those who held absolute power within those walls. The day arrived with an eerie stillness. The inmates were ordered out of their cells and herded into the courtyard, the heart of the prison where public punishments were carried out. The air was heavy, not just with heat and dust, but with fear. Everyone knew something terrible was about to happen, but no one dared to speak. The guards, standing with weapons in hand, made sure of that. Silence fell as the woman was dragged into the center. She looked fragile, broken already by days of torment, yet there was a haunting strength in her eyes. Some prisoners later recalled that she didn't cry, didn't beg for mercy. Others said her silence was forced, beaten into her long before this day. But one detail remained consistent in every witness's memory. She stood surrounded by her fellow inmates, staring death in the face, while the authorities of the prison watched with cold indifference. Then came the order. Stones, small at first, were thrown by those forced to participate. It was a ritual of cruelty, where even the unwilling were made complicit. To refuse meant punishment, possibly death. The woman's body jerked with every impact, but she remained upright for longer than anyone expected. With each stone, the atmosphere thickened with horror, as prisoners realized this was no quick execution. It was designed to prolong her suffering, to turn her death into a warning carved into their memories. Some inmates turned their faces away, unable to bear the sight. Others stared in shock, their expressions frozen between disbelief and terror. The guards barked orders, making sure no one dared to resist. The woman finally collapsed, but the stoning didn't stop. It continued until her body was lifeless, her blood soaking the ground, the sound of stones echoing like a nightmare that would never fade. When it was over, the courtyard was silent. No one moved, no one breathed too loudly. The prisoners returned to their cells, haunted by what they had just seen. For them, the message was clear. This prison had its own laws, its own justice, and no one was safe. The woman's death wasn't just a punishment. It was a warning, a performance of power, meant to crush any thought of defiance. And that is how her story began for the world outside, if the truth ever made it past the prison gates. Long before the stones were lifted, long before the courtyard filled with silence, there was the accusation, the spark that lit the fire of her execution. In a place where every word could become a weapon, rumors were as deadly as knives. Some inmates whispered that the woman had broken a sacred rule of the prison, a rule that was never written, but enforced with absolute cruelty. Others claimed she was innocent, a victim of a conspiracy designed to crush her spirit and remind everyone that power here was not questioned, only feared. The prison itself was a world within a world. Laws were dictated not by the outside government, but by those who held control inside: the guards, the warden, and the invisible code of honor among prisoners. To survive here, you followed rules even if you didn't understand them. Step out of line, and punishment was swift. But for this woman, the punishment was unlike anything seen before. The question was, what did she do to deserve such a fate? According to some accounts, she was accused of violating moral codes, perhaps forming a forbidden relationship or speaking out against authority. In conservative systems, such accusations alone could be enough to justify brutal punishment. Others said she had information the guards didn't want exposed, knowledge of corruption, smuggling, or abuse inside the prison walls. If true, then silencing her through death wasn't just punishment, it was cover-up. The story grew darker when whispers suggested she was targeted simply because she defied a guard, or refused to obey orders that stripped away her dignity. The truth, like so many things in prison, was buried beneath fear. Inmates who might have spoken remained silent, terrified of becoming the next example. Even the bravest among them knew that standing against the system was suicide. So the official story was allowed to spread unchecked. The woman had broken the rules, they said. The punishment was stoning, and no one dared to argue. What makes this accusation so haunting is the lack of evidence. There were no documents, no trial transcripts, no recorded charges, just words passed from one mouth to another, shaped by the will of those in power. In the outside world, accusations demand proof. In this prison, accusations were proof. Guilt was decided before the crime was even understood. The woman herself had little chance to speak. Accounts from prisoners describe her as quiet in her final days, resigned to a fate she knew she couldn't fight. Some remembered her muttering prayers under her breath. Others saw her staring through the bars, eyes burning with a kind of silent defiance. If she was guilty, she never confessed. If she was innocent, she never begged for freedom. Her silence only deepened the mystery of her story. Why her? Why that punishment? These questions may never be answered. But for the inmates who watched her final hours, the message was clear. Justice here was not about fairness or truth. It was about control. Her accusation wasn't just about her actions. It was about reinforcing fear. Anyone could be next. And so the conspiracy theory lived on. Some believed the guards wanted to send a message to rebellious prisoners. Others thought she was a scapegoat, sacrificed to hide corruption. But the cruelest belief of all was that it didn't matter whether she was guilty or not. Her fate was already decided, and the accusation was only the excuse they needed. By the time the courtyard filled with inmates and the stones were prepared, the truth of her alleged crime no longer mattered. What mattered was the show of power. Her death was staged not as justice, but as theater. An example carved into flesh and stone, teaching every prisoner that their lives were not their own. The courtyard was the stage, the prisoners the audience, and the woman the unwilling centerpiece of a performance of cruelty. By the time she was dragged out, her fate was already written. There was no suspense, no hope of a last-minute pardon. Every inmate standing around her knew what was about to unfold, and that knowledge weighed heavier than the prison walls themselves. The guards barked orders, their voices sharp and merciless. The inmates were arranged in a wide circle, leaving the woman alone in the middle. Her steps faltered as she was shoved forward, chains clinking against the ground. Some prisoners refused to look directly at her, terrified of locking eyes with someone condemned. Others couldn't look away, trapped by the horror they knew they were about to see. In most prisons, punishment is hidden behind doors. Solitary confinement, beatings in dark cells, starvation rations handed out as lessons in obedience. But here, punishment was public. It was designed not just to break the condemned, but to carve fear into the minds of everyone forced to watch. Public stoning was the ultimate symbol of control, slow, brutal, and impossible to forget. The first stone struck her shoulder, sharp enough to draw blood, but not enough to kill. That was the point. This wasn't meant to be quick. Each stone was part of a ritual, stretching her suffering into a display that would echo in the nightmares of everyone present. The woman flinched, but didn't scream. Some prisoners later swore she clenched her jaw so tightly that not a single plea escaped her lips. Stone after stone followed, hitting her arms, her legs, her ribs. Each impact drew gasps from the crowd, some muffled by hands pressed against mouths, others hidden in silence. The guards paced along the edges of the circle, watching closely. They wanted every prisoner to participate. To refuse meant suspicion, punishment, maybe even death. No one dared resist. Even those who despised the cruelty had to pick up stones and throw them, their hands trembling, their stomachs churning. They became unwilling executioners, forced to add to the suffering of someone who was already broken. The woman swayed, her body marked with cuts and bruises, blood dripping onto the dusty ground. Every movement she made became slower, weaker. Yet there was something haunting about her silence. Witnesses remembered the way she lifted her head after each blow, her gaze sweeping across the circle, as if she wanted each person to see her, to remember her face, to carry her story long after she was gone. Then came the heavier stones. They landed with sickening thuds, cracking bone, sending her staggering. When she finally fell to her knees, the crowd seemed to hold its breath. But the punishment didn't stop. The guards ordered the stoning to continue. Stones rained down on her body, striking her head, her chest, her back. Dust rose from the ground with every impact, mixing with the smell of iron in the air. By the time her body collapsed fully, limp and motionless, the stoning had already crossed the line between justice and cruelty. Yet the stones kept coming, as if the prison itself demanded more. It wasn't until the warden raised his hand that the final blows ceased. The silence that followed was suffocating. In that moment, the prisoners realized the purpose of what they had been forced to witness. It was not about punishing one woman. It was about controlling them all. The guards dragged her body away, leaving only a stain on the ground where she had fallen. No words were spoken, no explanation given. The prisoners were marched back to their cells, the sound of chains echoing in the corridors. Each step felt heavier than the last. They had not only watched a woman die, they had been part of her death. And that was the most chilling punishment of all. When the last stone fell and the body was dragged away, the prison didn't return to normal. It couldn't. The silence that followed was heavier than the punishment itself, pressing down on every prisoner who had been forced to watch. That night, in the echoing halls and dark corners of the cells, nobody spoke of what had happened. Not because they didn't want to, but because the fear was too deep. The prison operated on silence. It thrived on secrets, on the unspoken agreement that what happened inside these walls never left them. The woman's death was not recorded in official logs, not mentioned in any report. To the outside world, she had simply vanished, swallowed by the prison like so many others before her. Inside, however, the memory of her execution was carved into the minds of every inmate, a wound that would never heal. Those who had thrown stones were the most haunted. They had no choice, yet the guilt was unbearable. Many later described waking up at night to the sound of stones striking flesh, the image of her face staring back at them, silent but unyielding. They had been turned into executioners against their will, their humanity weaponized to destroy someone else's. The prison had succeeded in making them complicit, and that guilt was a chain heavier than any iron shackles. The guards enforced silence with brutality. Anyone caught whispering about the incident was beaten, locked in solitary, or disappeared without explanation. Fear spread like an infection. Inmates learned quickly. Do not mention her name. Do not ask questions. do not even think too loudly about what happened. To survive, they buried their memories, hiding their horror behind blank stares and forced obedience, but the secret couldn't be erased entirely. Some prisoners carried it in their eyes, a haunted look that told the truth even when their mouths stayed shut. And there were rumors, always rumors, that fragments of the story leaked beyond the walls. Maybe a guard spoke to someone outside, or an inmate who was eventually released whispered the tale to their family. Human rights groups sometimes heard whispers of atrocities in prisons like this, stories too brutal to believe. But without proof, without names or evidence, they remained shadows, quickly dismissed as rumors or propaganda. For the authorities, this was the perfect outcome. The execution had served its purpose: control through terror. The silence afterward proved that the system worked. No one dared resist, no one dared speak, and the prison continued its grim routine as if nothing had happened. The courtyard was washed clean, the stains scrubbed away, but the memory lingered in every corner of the prison. Among the inmates, however, the woman became something more than a victim. She became a symbol. To some, she was a warning, proof of what happens if you defy the rules. To others, she was a martyr, a reminder that even in death, she had shown defiance by refusing to cry out, refusing to beg. Her silence during her final moments gave strength to those who secretly dreamed of freedom, even if they never admitted it aloud. The guards may have erased her name from records, but they couldn't erase her from memory. The woman lived on in whispered stories, passed from one prisoner to another in the quietest hours of the night, when the risk of being overheard was smallest. For years, her death became part of the prison's dark mythology, a tale that spread like a curse, shaping the fears and hopes of every inmate who heard it. In the end, the aftermath wasn't just about the loss of one life. It was about the creation of an unspoken law. In this prison, justice was whatever the authorities said it was, and cruelty was their chosen weapon. The silence of the inmates wasn't just fear, it was survival. And yet, beneath that silence, the memory of the woman's final stand burned like a hidden fire, waiting for the chance to escape the shadows. Her death did not stay confined to the dusty courtyard of that prison. Even though the officials tried to erase it, even though the inmates were forced into silence, the echoes of those stones carried far beyond the walls. The bigger question that lingers, long after the blood was washed away, is this: was it justice? Or was it cruelty disguised as law? In some corners of the world, stoning is justified under strict interpretations of ancient codes, defended as tradition or moral duty. But what happens when those codes are enforced behind bars, without trial, without defense, without truth? It ceases to be justice. It becomes a weapon. And in this prison, that weapon was used with surgical precision. The woman's execution was not about her guilt or innocence. That much is clear. It was about power. It was about control. It was about showing every inmate that the rules here were absolute, and that questioning them, even in silence, could cost you your life. By forcing the prisoners to take part, the authorities ensured that her blood stained not just the ground, but their consciences. It was a method as old as tyranny itself: break people from the inside by making them complicit. But there's another side to this story, one that reveals something even more chilling. This incident was not unique. Across the world, in prisons hidden from cameras and media, punishments just as brutal still exist. From secret executions to public lashings, from tortures disguised as discipline to murders covered as accidents, prisons often become arenas where justice is twisted into spectacle. What happened to this woman is a reminder of what happens when unchecked authority is given absolute power. The international community often speaks of human rights, of dignity, of justice. Organizations write reports, lawyers fight cases, journalists search for the truth. But against prisons like this, sealed off, shrouded in silence, those voices rarely break through. And so the cycle continues. Inside those walls, silence reigns. Outside, the world moves on, unaware of the cruelty being carried out in the name of order. Yet her story matters. Even if her name was erased, even if her identity was buried, the memory of her final moments challenges us to ask, what is justice? Is it punishment designed to correct and reform? Or is it cruelty disguised as tradition? If the law becomes a weapon of fear, then justice dies, replaced by a performance of brutality. For the inmates who remain inside that prison, her death became a symbol of survival. Some obeyed more strictly out of fear, determined never to share her fate. Others carried her memory as a spark of defiance, a reminder that even in silence, even in suffering, dignity can survive. Her refusal to beg, her quiet defiance in the face of stones, gave her a power the guards never expected. In death, she became stronger than they imagined. The bigger picture reveals not only the cruelty of one prison, but the fragility of justice everywhere. When systems lack accountability, when voices are silenced, when fear becomes the law, then cruelty thrives. What happened in that courtyard was not an isolated event. It was the visible face of an invisible truth, that without vigilance, justice can be twisted, and prisons can become graveyards for both bodies and hope. And so, her story lingers, not just as a tragedy, but as a warning. A warning that justice without compassion becomes cruelty. A warning that silence allows brutality to thrive. And a warning that even the strongest walls cannot contain the truth forever, because somewhere, beyond the gates of that prison, her story escaped. And now it belongs to us, a reminder of what happens when cruelty is allowed to masquerade as justice, and a question that will not go away. Was this punishment? Or was it murder written in stone?